Let's delve again into the world of 1970s high-class Les Paul copies made in Japan. It's a strange and beautiful era. The Japanese economy, of course, was starting to take off at that time, and America's was sort of slowing down in the 70s. There was an interest in Japan in American rock music and the trappings and trophies that go along with it. This is when Japan became one of the centers of vintage guitar collecting. That whole thing was starting to take off as well. Since the mid-60s, Japan had been building guitars for the American market at fairly low price points. You know, entry-level guitars, beginner's models, etc. At some point in the 70s, they got into the risky business of ripping off American designs totally. We hear about the lawsuit era of the mid-70s. To be honest, there weren't very many lawsuits. There was a big one involving Ibanez, but mostly it was strongly worded letters and cease and desist kind of threats. The thing is, the world was a larger place then, and unless a guitar company had representation in a foreign country to do continuous legal battle, it was hard to defend stylistic trademarks unless that product was making its way into the US. If it was being made in Japan and being sold to the Japanese market, there wasn't all that much to be done, really. This Wild East state of affairs lasted from around 1977-ish to about 1985-ish. There are really three big names that stand at the top of the class. There are a lot of different smaller brands, but Greco, which was made by Fujigen, there were the Bernie guitars, which were made by Fernandez, which is a Japanese company with a Spanish name, and they had much of their product made by other Japanese makers. And then Tokai, or Tokai, which we have here. Tokai Gaki is a little different from some of the other big Japanese names in the guitar business. Often they had extremely long histories stretching back into the 19th century, but Tokai came about in the post-war era. And the other thing is that it was a family business that stayed in the family until just a couple of years ago. 2023, they were sold to a different corporation. They began building things in 1947, making harmonicas and pianos, which is interesting. You rarely hear harmonica piano duets. There's not a lot published in that repertoire. By the 60s, they started making electric guitars, somewhat in the vein of Mosrite. It's hard to underestimate the importance of surf music and the Ventures as inspiration for Japanese electric guitar players. Those guys were playing Semi Mosley's guitars. Tokai got involved in that. A little later, they struck up a partnership with Martin Guitars, building parts for the Sigma line of Martins, their offshore brand, as well as Martin electric guitars. Yes, Martin made electrics too. They're functional. In 1977, they started making exacting copies of Gibsons and Fenders. They weren't the only ones doing it, but they sure did it well. These things are made with species of wood that are correct for Gibson in the period. Things like this headstock veneer looks very, very similar to something you'd find from the Norland era. Finishes, I believe this is nitro. This one, it's Tokai Les Paul. The model is called Reborn. It's a Les Paul Reborn. That's pretty cheeky. And Gibson took note. At a certain point, this one is made in 1978, which is its first year of manufacture. By 1980, they changed the name to Reborn Old, which is very mystical. And then a couple of years later, it became Love Rock, which is less mystical, but kind of cute. So there's a pretty defendable argument to be made that these things were actually of higher quality, at least in terms of its quality control, than what was being produced by Gibson in 1978. On the whole, there's still excellent Gibsons made in 78, but there are also proportionally more problems than maybe other eras. And this thing, you know, these are highly valued at this point. Everything about them sort of screams, you know, do it as well as Gibson does. To the, you know, things like the maple cap is showing through on the side underneath the binding here, which is a sort of old school Les Paul standard look. The man wants new frets. I say okay. This thing actually has binding nibs, by the way. And like we've talked about those a lot recently, these are going away. You can actually get the E string stuck between the fret and the binding if you're vigorous with your bending. These are fairly low and wide, at 30 thousandths and probably 103-ish, yeah, 104. So yeah, this is Gibson style wire. So we get to action height, and here we go. He's one of these guys. And I looked at this and I said, "Are you serious?" And he says, "Yeah, no, this is fine. This is exactly how I like it. I get it, you know, I play it." I said, "I can't make this play unamplified without all kinds of buzzes." He says, "No, this is good. This is what I want." So it is just a fat 32nd of an inch. Less than a millimeter on the bass side. 2/64ths. And again, 2/64ths even. It's the way he likes it. With strings off, I'm going to examine the board a little bit here. There's not a tremendous amount of wear in the first position, just sort of surface scuffing. And actually the frets themselves are not bad at all. They're just low. Average height is around 30 thousandths, which suggests that maybe they've been leveled at some point. Although lower frets were kind of a thing for Gibson in the 70s. So there's the odd little thing here where it probably fell against a table or something and really indented the string in there. That's not too bad. And looking at the binding, I mean, there's some areas. Here's another little ding at the first fret. Whole scale resurfacing at the top end of the board is to be discouraged, I'm told, because there is a little model number, something embossed into the area behind the last fret. Inspect the inlays a little bit here. These are a plastic perloid, which is what Gibson used as well in their standards in the 1970s. Just want to check and see that they're not loose. This one, I think, yes, that could be stuck down. In the event that we were going to resurface this board, we'd have to think about these because they would have to come out. They're about like 50 thousandths thick usually, which is just over like 1.1 millimeters. There's not a whole lot of sanding room, and if they were maybe installed not perfectly flat in the slot, they could be thinner on the edges, for instance, and quite easy to sand through. So removing these requires heat, which is not always easy with plastic. So we usually end up using steam to steam them out, which means injecting a bunch of water into the board, which typically changes its color. Oftentimes it'll get much lighter in the areas that have been steamed. But they look okay. I will gently and carefully remove the frets. This is an old board. It is Indian rosewood. I'm going to gently score along the outline of each fret here, which will help cut down on the amount of chipping that can occur. I apply some heat with a soldering iron. I've ground the tip into a little concave shape so it's more secure. And then I pull them up using fret pullers, which are like flesh cutting nippers that are ground extra thin. Helps me get under the bead of the tang, and out it comes. Pretty clean. Here are the nibs. I gave the customer the option of retaining them, but the difference in price was enough for him to say, no, they can go. So we have to file and sand those down flat. I don't want to round them over like the rest of the binding because I need a little landing pad of plastic for the fret end to sit on. I'll re-glue the loose inlay. I'll put a little paste wax on the surface around the joint that's loose to make cleanup much easier. Just sort of flood the area with some super thin super glue, and I'll clamp it down with a capo. It does a good job. When it's dry, I can clean it right up. And then it's time to bend the fret wire. I want a radius that's just slightly tighter than the 12-inch radius of the neck. I'll cut the individual pieces to length. It's time to trim some tang. This is to remove a section at the end of the fret so that it can overlap the top of the binding. I use a fret tang nipper, which is a specialized tool. This is an older model from Stuart McDonald. They make a fancy new one that includes a little fence that acts as a depth stop and such. I'm sure at some point I'll get one of those, but this thing refuses to wear out, and I will not give up on it till it does. I do this over a little cardboard box. There's a sheet of cardstock in here. Well, it fits pretty snugly, but there's little gaps along the ends, so that when I'm done, I just shake it and all of the little sharp offcuts fall into the cracks there along the edge. And if I'm ever clumsy enough to knock this over, I won't have 3,000 vicious little metal shards to pick up, because a magnet won't help. They're non-ferrous. Every fret tang nipper, even the best ones, leave a little line of material that has to be removed down the center here. Just quickly file it off using a safe edge file. Time to install. I'm going to apply a little fish glue. Hammer the ends in, just sort of get it started. Then squeeze it in tight using my fret press. Clean up the excess glue that squeezes out and let it dry. After it's dry, I can clip the ends a couple of different ways. I wouldn't suggest holding the nipper like that. You want it sort of, the jaws are vertical, much less apt to pull the frets out of position. Protect the top with a little sheet of plastic here. And I also use a thin piece of sheet metal to rest the nippers against so they don't ding the body. And again, being careful to clean up all of these little fret ends. I will chamfer and cut back the remainder of the fret ends using a little tool that holds the file at an angle till it's nice and smooth and even with the edge. In the area above the joint with the body, sometimes I have to use a file. Right, I've got strings back on because I'm going to be securing this in the neck jig for the leveling process. I've also gone ahead and I've adjusted the truss rod so that the surface of the neck is perfectly straight in the playing position. I'm lucky in that there's enough tension on the rod so that it's engaged, and if need be I can always loosen it slightly in the future. That's probably not going to be necessary. Player's going to be using 10 gauge strings, should be fine. In the case of a neck that is naturally back-bowed though, and the truss rod is as loose as it'll go, I would have no choice but to level the surface of the board before fretting. Or perhaps use exceptionally tall fret wire and consign myself to the fact that in the end I'd have frets that are noticeably different heights. Like you could sight them and realize that the ones in the center of the board are likely much thinner than the ones on the ends. But in general, I want a straight neck when I dress the frets. The higher frets are causing the strings to buzz when I play them open. That means the nut slots are now too low. I expect by the time that I'm done dressing that won't be a problem. It's kind of amazing how much taller you can make the frets and still use the same nut. Not every time, but it frequently works out that way. And like I said, I was shown a guitar to use as reference for the way this player likes his setup. The strings buzzed in every position. The nut slots were also cut deep enough that they rested against the first fret when I did the pinch test. You know, there was no clearance there. Couple that with an extremely straight neck and action under 1 millimeter, 35 thousandths, 2/64ths-ish. I have to try and duplicate a condition that I would never allow under normal circumstances. The results would be unsatisfactory to anyone else. Like, I'd look like a hack. I can level these frets as straight as humanly possible, and with this setup that I'm going to be doing, the strings are going to buzz. There's no reference here, really. I just have to make sure I hit the spot between buzzing and too much buzzing. So I'll use the leveling beam, and I'm not putting a whole lot of pressure into this. It's fairly light touch. I'm going to dress these down to about 40 thousandths tall. The player likes frets that are sort of medium height. He doesn't want them too low, doesn't want them too high. I consider 30 thousandths on the low side, 50 thousandths would be high, so 40 thousandths is a good all-around sort of average height. Many people are satisfied with that. I darken the frets with a little marker, and then use my 3-corner file with safe corners, they've been ground so they don't cut into the fretboard, to do the recrowning. And this is simply removing enough material to establish a kind of rounded shape, and I should be left with just a little hair of marker right down the center of the fret. Using 600 and 1200 grit sandpaper, I'll sort of flop against the surface of the frets, going back and forth. This breaks that sort of faceted thing that happens from the file and blends them over into a nice smooth curve. This is not unlike the technique that Gibson used when they were dressing their frets in the factory. Then it's on to polishing, polishing, polishing. Yeah, using micro mesh pads, digging into the corners, really making them shine. I'll treat the fret ends, I'll roll them over using a safe edged file, and then sand those up to 8000 grit as well. Okay, the player would like me to check out the pickups. He's suspicious that this one has been replaced, and if that is the case, he actually has an anti-replacement to replace it with. And just looking here, this like 90% of the Les Pauls that come in is missing one of the pickup ring mounting screws, which, you know, how does that happen? Well, I know how it happens. These things tend to fly off wherever it is that you're working and end up under a couch somewhere, never to be seen again. But still, I got to look through my collection, and it happens so frequently that my collection is always depleted. We shall see. Okay. Well, this has a rubber stamp on there that says patent applied for, which looks nothing like the little black sticker that Gibson actually used when they were putting their patent applied for stickers on their pickups. And this says made by Goto, G-O-T-O, which I suppose makes this a proper pickup. That's good. The cavity looks not unlike a Les Paul cavity. And this pickup ring suffered an unfortunate incident at some point. It's been repaired or stuck together. I want to be careful with this screw. I'm just looking to the side here. There are a couple of scuffs, or maybe that's glue residue. It's possible this thing was reassembled in place, which would possibly mean that it's adhered to the surface of the guitar, which, as you might imagine, could pose issues. Well, I guess we're okay. And this one also has patent applied for, made by Goto. G-O-T-O, not Goto with an H. Yeah, I've mentioned this before. I'll mention it again. Backwards for about a turn before you start progressing forwards, because you want the screw to fall into the previously chased grooves that it cut into the top the first time it was installed. I say it a lot. We all say it now. I've seen a number of different videos mentioning that. I think the first person who I ever saw in the guitar video world mention this fact was Fran Blanche. But I've seen Levon frequently says it. I think Emerson, Trying to Guitar, puts it in some of her videos. But yeah, it's, you know, very annoying when you're reassembling something like this and you go to put a screw and you realize that the hole has been stripped out. And you got to take everything apart, you got to plug it, and then you got to wait for it to dry, and then you got to cut it off flush and then re-drill. Just backwards, one turn. This is one of the most interesting parts of the guitar, because for some reason they decided to use a printed circuit board to mount the pots to. The cavity also has shielding paint in it, which is a nice touch. But the PCB idea was eventually adopted by Gibson some 30 years later. It's like they had a time machine. No American manufacturer was doing that in 1978. Well, that's that. I have hit the mark for action. It is 1/32 of an inch, 0.8 millimeters, 2/64 on both the treble and bass side. There is some generalized string rattle on the bass strings, but no fretting out. Put it this way, you couldn't tune this down a full step. It would be unplayable. Final impressions, this is the most accurate Les Paul copy I've ever encountered, with the exception of the electronics cavity, of course. Is this a fake? Was it made to deceive? I don't think so. I wouldn't say that. Not in the way that the modern Gibsons are, with their actual Gibson branding and the whole bit. To most people who know guitars, those Gibsons feel like an insult, really. This is completely different. They put their name on the headstock, it says Tokai, and it's obvious that they tried really, really hard to get it right. You know, this feels more like veneration than deception. One more thing, because people are going to ask, how much do you suppose it weighs? 9 pounds. Just over 4 kilograms. Contrast that with the heaviest Norlin era Les Paul I've ever lifted, which was a wine red custom, a 2 pickup model. That one weighed 14 pounds, 3 ounces. 6.5 kilograms, you know. This is a pleasure to strap on. I kind of like it.